Hey, welcome back to my Dinar Daily YouTube channel. The phrase new ballgame is overused in financial commentary, but in the context of Iraq's monetary reform trajectory, it carries genuine descriptive weight. What is unfolding in Iraq right now is not a continuation of the old exchange rate management debate, the familiar tug-of-war between the official rate, the parallel market, and the CBI's auction window. It is something structurally different: the simultaneous convergence of digital currency, infrastructure, international trade agreement expansion, Kurdistan oil export resumption, and perhaps most significantly the central bank governor himself going on national television to tell Iraqi citizens that their country is internationally connected. That last development alone deserves careful attention. Allah's public declaration of Iraq's international integration, following a 10-day absence from the public stage and delivered with the evident endorsement of Prime Minister al-Sudani, is not casual. Commentary: central bank governors in reform phase economies do not make televised declarations of international connectivity at the existing exchange rate. The implied message, to anyone reading the institutional signals rather than just the literal words, is that the 1310 rate is not the rate at which Iraq intends to conduct its emerging international economic relationships. The Kurdistan oil tap, now being turned on at an initial rate of 185,000 barrels per day, with a mandate to scale toward full federal budget capacity, is not being activated into a 1310 world. The double taxation agreement with Switzerland, one of the world's most sophisticated financial jurisdictions and a gateway to European institutional capital, is not being signed to facilitate trade at a rate that every serious economist agrees undervalues Iraq's asset base. These are the actions of a country preparing for a different monetary reality, and the sequencing of these actions all occurring within the same compressed time frame is not coincidental. The trade and civilization framing introduced at the opening of this analysis, that trade with neighboring and friendly nations is the foundational element of building civilization and raising the value of natural resources, is more than rhetorical flourish. It encapsulates the philosophical underpinning of Iraq's current reform posture. A nation's currency is not merely a medium of exchange. It is a declaration of economic sovereignty and a signal of productive capacity to the world. When Iraq's currency is priced at 1310 to the dollar, it communicates falsely that Iraq's productive capacity, natural resource base, and economic potential are worth approximately 0.076 cents per unit of sovereign expression. That valuation is absurd on its face for a country sitting atop one of the world's largest proven oil reserves, advancing a development road project that will become a major transcontinental trade corridor, and now activating Kurdistan's northern oil export pipeline into Turkey's Ceyhan terminal. The asset backing for a significantly higher dinar valuation is not hypothetical. It is sitting underground, flowing through pipelines, and being quantified in federal budget projections. What has been missing is not the assets. What has been missing is the political clearance to let the currency reflect them. The digital dimension of this transition is where the most important structural innovation is occurring, and it is the element most consistently underestimated by observers focused on the traditional mechanics of currency revaluation. The conventional concern: does Iraq have enough US dollars to cover the dinar in circulation at a new, higher rate, misunderstands how modern digital monetary systems actually function. In a digitized financial architecture, banks hold foreign currency assets on their books as reserve instruments rather than as physical vault holdings. The IQD, once digitized and internationally compliant through ISO 2022 frameworks, becomes a tradable digital asset, that correspondent banks worldwide can hold as a foreign reserve position without requiring the physical movement of dollars. This is not a technicality, it is the entire mechanism through which the scale problem that critics raise is actually resolved. Iraq does not need to physically possess trillions of dollars to revalue the dinar. It needs a credible digital infrastructure, adequate reserve backing at the institutional level, and international correspondent banking relationships that allow the new rate to clear through the global financial system. The ISO 2022 compliance work, the Federal Reserve correspondent account activations, the double taxation agreements, and the digital finance integration ALAC referenced are all components of exactly this infrastructure. They are not peripheral developments. They are the machinery of the revaluation itself. Economic expert Omar al-Halbousi's candid analysis of the dinar's exchange rate crisis provides an important corrective to any narrative that presents Iraq's monetary situation as uniformly positive. His identification of three structural dysfunctions: trade with sanctioned countries requiring financing outside the official platform, the parallel market operating as the real exchange rate controller beyond CBI authority, and the penetration of private banks that dominate the currency selling window through foreign interest influence, describes the exact pathology that has made monetary reform simultaneously necessary and difficult for years. These are real problems, and they have not been fully resolved. The parallel market premium, the dollar bleeding through compromised private banking channels, and the CBI's historically limited authority over the true market rate are legitimate concerns that any honest assessment of the dinar investment thesis must acknowledge. What has changed, however, is the political and institutional environment in which these problems exist. The U.S. pressure on Iranian-backed militia networks, the structural reforms being implemented under IMF guidance, the correspondent banking reintegration, and the constitutional clarification of political processes, all represent direct attacks on the enabling conditions for these dysfunctions. Sanctioned country trade financing depends on political protection networks. Dollar bleeding through private banks depends on regulatory capture. Parallel market dominance depends on the absence of a credible official rate that the international system will support. Each of these dependencies is being systematically weakened, and as they weaken, the structural space for a clean, internationally recognized rate adjustment expands. U.S. Republican Representative Joe Wilson's "Make Iraq Great Again" framing, whatever one makes of its political theater dimension, reflects something real about the current disposition of American political interest in Iraq's economic trajectory. The bipartisan American political consensus on Iraq has shifted from the post-2003 occupation model, where Iraq was primarily a security problem requiring containment, to a 21st century economic partnership model where Iraq is a resource-rich reconstruction opportunity requiring investment. That shift has enormous implications for the dinar reform timeline, because it means American political will is now aligned with the outcome that serious dinar investors have been anticipating. American companies cannot invest in Iraq's private sector at the scale required for economic transformation if the currency is artificially suppressed at 1310. The Development Road Project cannot attract the European, Asian, and Gulf capital it needs at a rate that makes Iraqi assets appear fundamentally cheap in ways that create political resentment rather than investment enthusiasm. The "Make Iraq Great Again" slogan is not just political rhetoric. It is a description of the economic outcome that American policy is currently structured to facilitate, and a revalued, internationally integrated dinar is a foundational prerequisite for that outcome. The private sector opportunity that flows from currency reform, the development road, and the industrial cities being planned along its corridor is genuinely transformational in scale. A properly valued dinar makes imported capital equipment cheaper, makes Iraqi labor internationally competitive on quality-adjusted terms, makes the country's non-oil revenue base, taxation, services, manufacturing more economically viable, and makes the gas monetization and natural resource development projects that Iraq has been planning for years financially executable at rates of return that attract serious institutional capital. The agricultural sector, historically one of the most productive in the ancient world, becomes economically viable for modernization investment when the currency reflects real value. The tourism infrastructure of a country that contains some of the oldest archaeological heritage on Earth becomes developable when international visitors are not operating in a distorted exchange rate environment. The private sector going crazy, as one analyst predicted, is not hyperbole if the monetary reform is executed cleanly. It is the natural consequence of removing a decade-long artificial cap on Iraq's economic potential. The stepped reform sequence described an initial in-country revaluation slightly above $1, followed by the project to delete the zeros, and a currency swap as the digital transition proceeds reflects the most operationally credible pathway through which a reform of this magnitude could be executed without creating destabilizing shock. A sudden large-scale revaluation announced without preparation would create chaos in import pricing, public sector wage calculations, and foreign debt denominations. A managed, sequenced approach: announce the in-country rate, begin the currency swap, build public familiarity with the new denomination, then activate the international rate in alignment with the digital infrastructure, allows the reform to proceed without the systemic disruption that critics fear. This is how monetary reforms of this type have historically been executed in comparable economies, and the evidence suggests Iraq's central bank understands this sequencing requirement. What remains, as it has always remained, is the honest acknowledgement that nobody, no redemption center contact, no wealth management source, no military insider knows the precise day and time. The structural case is real. The trajectory is clear. The institutional machinery is running. But the timeline belongs to the sovereign decision-makers in Baghdad, coordinating with their international partners in Washington, Geneva, and the IMF. The discipline required of serious investors in this moment is exactly what it has always been. Understand the thesis deeply enough to hold it through the noise, and resist the temptation to replace that understanding with the false comfort of insider timeline predictions that have yet, in any iteration, to prove accurate.